When we look at the end of the war, several important events are going to take place within World War One. One of those is the Russian Revolution of 1917. And so Russia was already facing protests and uprisings before World War One. If you remember, the revolution of 1905 kind of fizzled out, but those ideas persisted. And now, in the midst of World War One, Russia was facing food shortages. They kept losing battles and millions of casualties in the war. And so, facing these uprisings, ultimately the Tsar, Nicholas II, was unable to deal with these growing problems, and he steps down and abdicates the throne. And a new provisional government is put in his place. And this new government takes over, and they do issue a lot of liberal reforms. However, they didn't feel that they had the power to get Russia out of World War One because they were just a provisional government. And so Russia continued to lose battle after battle in World War One. And so it's into this situation that Lenin and the Bolsheviks are going to seize power in the Russian Revolution of 1917. So Lenin had been a supporter of Marxism, and remember, he adapted communism to fit in with Russian society and said that the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution, could take place without a large proletariat as long as you had leadership. And so he provided that leadership. Lenin had actually been exiled to Switzerland, but he sneaks back into Russia with help from Germany. And Germany hoped that by sneaking Lenin into Russia, it would cause disruptions, which ultimately it did. And so in the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks are going to seize power. They're going to take power from this provisional government. They storm the Winter Palace and overthrow it. And their slogan was peace, land, and bread. And that's what they wanted. They wanted peace. They wanted out of World War I. They wanted land redistributed to the lower classes, and they wanted an end to these food shortages. And so one of the first things that they do is negotiate. Once the Bolsheviks take power, they negotiate a treaty with Germany to get out of World War I. Now, they had to give up a lot of their Western territory that had already been kind of taken by the Germans in order to get out of World War I, but they negotiate this treaty, and that kind of freed them up to deal with the growing issues in Russia. And so now with Russia out of the war, this really put Britain and France in a poor spot because now Germany could take all of those troops that were fighting in Russia and dedicate them to that Western front. Well, at about that same time period, the United States is going to enter the war. When the war first breaks out, the United States tried to stay neutral. They tried to stay out of it. President Wilson, time and time again, stuck to this idea of neutrality. But gradually, the United States is going to get pulled into the war. First, financially, they begin to sell weapons and supplies to mostly the Allies. And they become financially involved in the war first. Then Germany begins to sink passenger ships with their submarines. They sink a British passenger ship called the Lusitania that also had 128 Americans on board. And so this upset the United States and kind of built some discontent towards Germany in the United States. And Germany promised to stop sinking passenger ships without warning. Well, then a short time later, they sink a French passenger ship. And again, this upset the United States, but it wasn't enough to pull them into war. Well, then Germany announces that they're going to sink any ships in the war zone. And so Germany commits to this idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. And they start sinking U.S. merchant ships. And ultimately, it's the sinking of U.S. merchant ships, along with the famous Zimmerman telegram, a secret note that Germany tried to pass to Mexico that basically told Mexico if they would attack the United States, that Germany would ensure that Mexico got territory that had been lost to the U.S. back after the war. And so those two things ultimately pull the United States into the war. And the United States, it took a little while because we weren't prepared to enter the war. We had to mobilize our factories. We had to mobilize our troops. But the U.S. troops did arrive, and they were fresh, and really helped kind of reinforce the Allied troops and really helped turn the tide of the war, because Germany was very close to winning World War I. After Russia withdrew, Germany began to make gains on that Western Front, because now they could use all those troops on the Western Front and were gradually pushing towards Paris. However, once again, they kind of outrun their supply lines, and the United States arrives just at the right time, and they begin to bolster that Western Front and gradually begin to force Germany back. And so Germany is forced to ultimately surrender. And when Germany surrenders, a lot of the Germans were stunned, because propaganda campaigns in Germany basically told the German people that they were winning. And censorship kind of ensured that the German people thought they were close to winning World War I. Well, when they lose, they had to find a scapegoat. And so myths start to spread that Germany was betrayed by socialist and Jewish politicians, and ultimately that's why they lost World War I. And that's going to be used by groups like the Nazi Party and Hitler following World War I to build support for their regime.